white man's clothing. What is this and what does this have to do with Africa? The secondhand clothing is a massive industry and one that's affecting Africa's own textile industry. So I wanted to speak to a couple of people, in particular, one of the founders of an organization called OR Foundation. Let's dive in and let's explore the impact of secondhand clothing, specifically in Ghana today. I'm Jacqueline Shaw, I'm your African fashion business coach. I'm the host of this YouTube channel, African Fashion Guide. I just want to encourage you also to just make sure that you subscribe to the channel below so you can be updated on every video that comes out every single Thursday. Now let's jump into the interview and let's speak to Liz from OR Foundation.
Cool.
Hey Liz, how are you doing? Love to have you here.
Hi, Jacqueline. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much. I'm excited to have this conversation because, as I was saying to you before we did this interview, secondhand clothing was a major bugbear for me in my own research when I started looking at Africa's textile industry, specifically in Ghana. And I remember going over there at the beginning of my master's degree in ethical fashion, interviewing, doing focus groups with young people, and specifically young people, because I thought they're the right ones to speak to because they're the ones who are like the purchasers or the interested in fashion today. And I was quite surprised by the comments that I got back. That's why I thought, let me just have this conversation, because my responses were that they wanted the secondhand clothing. They saw it as a good thing. They saw it as good quality. Now, I had an assumption that this was not the case. So let's talk about, and we'll get back to that. But first of all, let's talk about the OR Foundation and what you and Branson have set up, why you've done this. Let's talk about that. Tell me a little bit more about yourselves and about the OR Foundation.
Okay, so thank you. I have a background in the fashion industry. So I studied fashion design, worked as a stylist and also designer in New York City. And then I've also taught fashion design at the University of Cincinnati and a couple other places. So I have a, relatively good understanding of sustainability issues across the supply chain, and also had sort of a front row seat, to seeing the waste that's created on the pre-consumer side of fashion. And so in 2011, I started working with Branson, who's now my partner. He had a fair trade fashion company that was based in Labadi, which is part of Accra.
Awesome.
And it was a relatively short-lived company, but that was what first introduced me to secondhand clothing, because I came there, my first trip to Accra involved doing some upcycling with a Ghanaian designer, and we were sourcing some of the clothing from Continental Market. And then shortly after that company, we stopped selling clothing, basically because we realized that in the world of sustainable fashion, it wasn't really allowing us to convey what we wanted to convey. Like we would, be selling a fair trade product, but most people didn't have the education to really understand what that meant. And so we felt like instead of trying to make new products, maybe we should focus more on education, and then we could, potentially come back to product at some other point. But so we started this education program where we were connecting students in 5 states in the US with students in Ghana and South Africa. Gotcha. And they would make these objects for one another, made out of textiles, and learn to sew and talk about the value of, making things in the design process and making natural dyes, etc. Exchange them with one another, and then go through this curriculum on globalization and fashion for a whole year together. And as part of that curriculum, our students had to sort of trace the story of one article of clothing in their closet in a very interdisciplinary fashion. And, for our students in the United States, whenever they're done with their clothing, and these were middle school students, 10 to 14 years old primarily, so they're going to grow out of their clothing, and they have to do something with it. And so a lot of them would end up donating their clothing to a Goodwill or Salvation Army, but then they didn't know where it went after that. And then our students in Ghana were sort of on the other side. They were receiving this clothing, right? And so all of our students, as soon as school was over, they would take off their school uniforms and put on their Obruniwawu, which means dead white man's clothes. Yeah. And so we started researching that with them and going to the market. And really this project, Dead White Man's Clothes, came about because through going to the market with our students, we started seeing it shift. So we started seeing how the amount of clothing coming was increasing, you know, because the secondhand clothing trade is just the inverse of the first-hand clothing trade, right? So as you have increased production in the global north, you're going to have increased supply of secondhand clothing. So we started seeing that.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And we also just, with that, because there's such excess, it was changing the character of the market. So, you know, we were talking to retailers and they started saying, you know, this is no longer a good job. They can't really make as much money anymore, but also it doesn't feel as dignified, you know, even just aesthetically, like they feel like they're sitting in other people's waste, you know, and before it wasn't always like that. And so in 2016, that's really why we decided to launch this project. And we saw that there was a need, I think, within the sustainable fashion community to really dive deep into one place over multiple years, to really understand, again, how is it changing and what are the nuances of the situation.
So are you working with the schools? You said you're running a program in Ghana. It's with your students from the US in Ghana. Okay.
No,
So
with students. No, we never took students from the US to Ghana. It was they created objects that they traded with one another. So it was like a sort of modern pen pal program that was meant to explore sustainability in fashion. Yeah.
So when you're working in Ghana and you're seeing all these, you know, the increase now, because when I did my research, that was 11 years ago. And that was, the idea that, you know, it was loved, it was adored, it was seen as good quality. And now you're saying, people are saying they feel like they're sitting in other people's clothing and it's probably not as appreciated. Do you think that the rise of interest towards African culture and a sense of pride and identity and heritage is kind of playing towards that? So there's more appreciation of wearing traditional or wearing what is Ghanaian stroke African. Do you think that's made an issue or more?
I think it's starting to. I think what's interesting is more seeing this hybrid. You know, I think there's some pushback, you know, from young Ghanaians that we talk to around this idea of, like, you know, traditional African cloth or traditional dress. You know, they're kind of questioning, what is that? Like, what does it mean for me to be African in a modern age? So I think for them, it's sort of, you know, again, the people that we've talked to have sort of said it's more of a hybrid. Like, they want to draw on those traditions and they want to draw on the things that are familiar and that have resonance with their culture, and especially just the colors and, you know, the design heritage, but they want to blend that with, you know, things that are more global, because they're also, I mean, they're on Instagram, you know, they're more plugged into what's happening around the world and trends than most people. So they want to participate in that as well, right? But they want to do it in their own way. I think you brought up a really good point. You know, I think the reality is that most people in Ghana still view the secondhand clothing trade positively. But the more that they're becoming aware of the impacts of the waste, it is shifting the conversation. But I think, you know, the fact that it's viewed positively is less about maybe what's available or about the clothing itself. It's really just that it's cheap, and it's also that it's like a diverse range of product offerings, you know. So when we first started the research in 2016, consumers would tell us that they like shopping at Contamanto because you're never going to see your neighbor wearing the same thing that you're wearing. Versus if you purchase African cloth, you know, you might design it into a silhouette that's different than what your neighbor has, but they might still be wearing the same cloth. So there's that kind of balance. But I think, again, something that I think is so important for people who have never been to Ghana to understand is just there's a different way of relating with clothing, you know, in a way that I think is really inspiring. So, you know, all of our students, they were wearing a Bruniwawu, but they still grew up going to the market, buying cloth, taking it to a tailor,
Yes.
having something made to fit their body, which most people in the global north, I mean, I don't know any of my friends who've ever had it. Like maybe when you get married, you get to have something made to fit your body.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's a cottage industry, and I mean, me doing fashion design as a career, I started off after I left uni sewing for weddings because, well, just to make money, and then to get what you're looking for a job and you want to make money to pay those student debts, and it was something that I was able to do, and it was African weddings that was the ones that I was sewing for, so it was a huge one. But just looking at that industry, let's just help people to understand why this is a challenge. I mean, from my perspective, working in fashion, and when you're yours as well, we know that there's pros and cons. I know there's a narrative around secondhand clothing and wearing things again rather than keep making new products. Because it's taken from the earth, it's taken from the environment, it's creating waste. But then these secondhand clothing, when it comes to African economies or developing worlds, it's a term that I just it's one of those things where it's also taken away from local production, which is bringing money into the local economy. And also there's the mentality of secondhand clothing from those in the so-called West, where they think they're doing good. The education is, give your clothing to secondhand shops and thrift shops and you're doing good. And they think, okay, I've sent it to the shop, it's disappeared. It's helping somebody in need. But the reality is those clothes go through so many levels of, from villages to villages to villages, from cities. And they just, I mean, the video that you showed as well, was it your video?
Yeah, the ITV video.
Yeah, the ITV one, and it's just showing just the mountains of this. That's just ending up, it's just dumping our stuff here in the so-called West to Africa. It's like getting rid of it, but it's still end up somewhere. So maybe you can go a little bit more into that. Some of the figures you mentioned about 40% of the clothing goes to waste. Maybe let's dive into educating people on what actually happens, the process of this. Thanks.
Absolutely. No, so I think as you said, people donate things and they don't know where it's going, or they have this this idea that it is doing good or it's going to be given away for free to somebody who needs it. And I think what's important for people to know is that there are people who need clothes everywhere in the world, like in the UK, in the US, in Ghana, everywhere in the world, there are some people who need clothes. But the reality is that we've been looking at this as charity for so long that we don't realize that it costs money to do well. Like, this is waste management. So when we donate our things, we drop them off often in a garbage bag, but then we say it's not garbage. We drop it off or put it in the bin inside of a garbage bag. And then we don't really think about the labor that it takes, no matter where you are, to sort it, to clean it if you haven't cleaned it, to bale it up and to export it, or to deliver it to somebody in your community who needs it, right? And so for so long, we've just been dropping this stuff off and not really ever supporting these companies in doing it well. And so we don't have the infrastructure to actually get the clothing to the people who need it the most, right? Yes. And so what has ended up happening is you have, it's a for-profit industry, and they need to find a market for this clothing. And so it's being exported all over the world, usually the better quality things that are called cream usually, or like the vintage Levi's, for instance.
That one.
Yeah. Those are, sent to maybe Spain or Poland or Japan. But the lower grade stuff is going to be sent more to the continent of Africa. Yeah. So Ghana is one of the main ports of entry. And so for Kantamanto market in Accra, Ghana is the largest secondhand clothing market in West Africa, if not in the world. And what we found in our research is that there's 15 million items coming through that market every single week. And Ghana's population is only 30 million people, just over 30 million people.
That's just crazy.
And this is just one market in Ghana. There are multiple markets, but Kantamanto is the biggest. So you can assume that most of it's not going to be sold, right? Or it would have to be slow. It would have to make economic sense for people to take all of that clothing and disperse it, build the infrastructure to disperse it and get it to the people across all of West Africa who need it, right? And that doesn't happen because the bales are expensive. It's expensive to import a container, and the bales are really expensive. So when people in Contamanto buy these bales, they need to make their money back as fast as possible, right? And what we've found is that basically retailers, when they buy these bales, they take them into the retailer side of the market and they open them and they start sorting them into selections. And the first selection only makes up around 18% of every bale. And that's going to be the stuff that doesn't look that worn, or it's really popular brands, or maybe it even still has the tags on it, but that's the high value stuff, and that's the stuff people want. And then the rest of it, they have to work a lot harder to sell, right? And basically because there's such excess, and then again because it's an excess of a low quality product, fast fashion, they can't sell it all. No one wants it. So basically what we found is that 40% of the average bale leaves the market as waste. So it's not sold. So that's a lot of clothing. Yeah.
It's scary because that is just, it's a pollutant. It's just ending up in the land of Ghana or in African countries. It's just ending up there and just increasing the waste. And what do you know what the government is doing around that, or any kind of groups aside from you guys? What is being done with that 40%?
Well, the government is becoming more aware, and we've worked especially with the local government in Accra since we started our research, and they're quite involved. But I think they feel quite powerless, to be honest, and also it was unexpected. So, for instance, the landfill. So the main landfill that Accra was using is called Pone Landfill, and it's actually really close to the harbor, to Tema, which I'm sure you know, where the clothing comes in, right? Which is just ironic because the clothing is coming off the ships there, and then it goes like a half an hour to the market, and then a week later it's back at the landfill. But that landfill was built, was planned to operate for 8 years, basically based off of the per capita, waste that they had calculated for their citizens, not taking into account waste that would be imported. And so, the government wasn't really planning on a waste management infrastructure that would facilitate that. So what you have now is you have the local government, the Accra Metropolitan Assembly, picks up 2 loads from the market every day. So one in the morning and one in the evening. And when we started our research in 2016, it was 50 tons of clothing waste, specifically clothing, a day. And now it's over 70 tons a day that's handled formally by the government. And that's going to be...
Where's it go?
That was going to the landfill. But the landfill was caught on fire in August. So in the ITV, they're, showed the drone shot of the landfill, and it's not operational anymore. And I was there in August, the day I didn't know it was going to be on fire, but I showed up there to do research, and it was in flames. And it wasn't a controlled burn. A lot of people, see images of burning waste in Africa and think that it's, intentional. This was not that. This was very much an accident. And it's still on fire. So that was August, and it's still on fire. It's still burning. And so basically they can't use it. So a lot more of the clothing is being handled informally, or being dumped, or being taken by the government further away. So they have to take it more than an hour now to dump it in an old quarry, which is not really an effective waste management strategy. But besides all of that, the government could never manage to pick up all the waste because it's so much more than they can even handle with the trucks that they have available to them. And again, the landfill capacity that they have. So basically, they were only picking up 1/3 to half of the waste. And then the rest of it has always been handled informally. So that means it's being handled by private collectors, and by individuals who are picking up very small amounts, and they're taking it to informal dumps. So the ITV piece showed one of those informal dumps that we're walking around on, and that's an old Fadama. That's one of the biggest ones, but you see them all over. Sometimes the clothing, it's just any sort of open space, it just can get dumped there. And then it's also sometimes buried into the sand and the beaches, or dumped, into the gutters, and eventually winds up in the ocean.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And then it's a whole cycle, because then, yes, eaten by sea animals, and then back into the systems of us as humans. And this is the whole issues with plastics. And we know that there's a lot of plastics which are in clothing, especially these days, because it's just fast fashion mixes a lot with polyesters.
Yep.
And that is secreting into the water stream, into the oceans. And when we really know, sometimes knowing too much about it is scary. Like,
it's horrible. Yes, it gets really overwhelming.
Yeah. What solutions have you seen? Like, I mean, I can only kind of feel that it's kind of what you're doing is a bit of awareness raising and education for the consumer into how you can fix clothes or reuse clothes yourself, or keep clothes for longer. But the fact is, until the industry is producing clothing that is all natural, all biodegradable, no toxins, no dyes, and all of this stuff, or not unless it's natural dyes, clothing is going to still keep going. Mm-hmm. The clothing industry and the clothing production, the way that is still going to keep going until they can produce clothing where the whole industry is just biodegradable. Then we know that at least it's going back into the earth and it's natural. But that's not the reality. What have you seen people are doing as solutions for this catastrophic situations happening in our industry today?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it on the head in the sense of needing new materials that are going to be able to cycle through the system in a way that's positive for the environment. For us, we see our work definitely as advocating on the consumer level, but also a lot of the work that we do sort of offline is more having conversations with the design community, okay, and with the exporting associations and different exporters in the global north, to try to think about, policy solutions around this. And in Ghana, so much of what we do is really about trying to bring transparency to people there, because I think, again, most people in the market, they could see the waste building up around them, but they didn't always have access to the information that we are privileged enough to have access to in terms of understanding the global fashion industry. So they're not necessarily aware of, why is so much more clothing coming here? Why are the fabrics all changing? Why is, fast fashion impacts the construction, and that's something I think is so important for people to understand, is like a lot of this clothing is going to waste, not because it's necessarily unwearable. It's wearable, but it's not special. Like, people in Ghana don't just want crap. Like, fast fashion has as few seams as possible because that's how you make it as cheaply as possible. And again, people in Ghana are used to having things made to fit their body. Like, they have a different standard. Mm-hmm. And so it's just not that attractive to them. But so trying to bring that awareness to people there, involve as many people as we can in Ghana in different activities. So we do like beach cleanups. Yeah. And that was something that was really overwhelming, to be honest. We did a beach cleanup in January, and we were looking at basically, would it be feasible to try to recover waste from the ocean? Is that something we should be trying to focus on? And it was really overwhelming because it took us about 3 hours to recover 600 garments with a group of around 40 people. And and that might seem like a lot to people, but that's one bale of clothing. Like, that's the equivalent of one bale of clothing. So it's barely a dent, right? But it took that long because the clothing, what had soaked up the water, obviously, and was filled with sand. It was so heavy, we had to dig it out of the ground. It's not just like floating on the water.
Yeah.
And what was really scary is that the sand inside of it was black. And so we have like aerial footage from the beach cleanup, and you can see just like trails of black all across the beach. And that's all the stuff that came out of the clothing. So we try and involve people in that, or going to the landfill. So for us, it's really about making sure that, you know, the future of fashion needs to be more inclusive. There's, in my mind, nothing revolutionary about people in the global north who have had power for so long deciding what the next phase of fashion looks like, deciding what sustainability looks like. So for me, our goal is that we need to equip people in Ghana with this holistic understanding of what is going on, so that they feel empowered to decide what they want to do moving forward. You know, like, what kind of fashion industry do they want? What materials do they want to invest in? You know, what does it mean to be a designer in Ghana versus to, or, you know, to patron designers in Ghana versus to buy secondhand? You know, they need to have this education to be able to make those decisions, and to eventually be able to approach authorities with any sort of like policy agenda that they might have.
Yeah.
So for us, that's part of it. But very practically, you know, we see the amount of waste increasing, not decreasing. So, you know, I think we're always going to be focused on advocating in the global north and trying to raise awareness on that side. And hopefully it will make some sort of difference. But I think just as you have more cities setting zero waste goals and trying to divert more clothing from landfills, and you have more people excited about the circular economy, which is really great. But what it's doing is we don't have a solution. So what we're ending up doing is diverting more from our landfills by exporting it, right? And that's going to continue for a long time. So we think there's going to be an increase in the amount of clothing coming to Ghana. So for us, just very practically, we're trying to figure out what we can do with that material.
Yes.
So something that we're doing with a group of people in Ghana is building a shredder. So we started building one.
This was something I wanted to do for when I did my degree.
Yeah.
Shredding and knitting with the shredded pieces and things like this.
Yeah, I think that, you know, we built a prototype. Yeah, we built a prototype in January just to see how people would respond, if it was something that we should pursue or not. And it was really positive. I think, you know, because it was this act of transformation, I think it was just like, oh, clothing doesn't have to be clothing anymore. We don't have to think of it just as this waste product. We can put it through this process and it can become something else, something new. And that presents new possibilities for people in Ghana to think about what to do with it. And ultimately, you know, we've been throughout this process talking to ATL, to Akasomo Textiles Limited, and, you know, visited their factory recently, and talking about, you know, the goal is ultimately that this waste could become feed to revitalize the textile industry in Ghana.
Well, that was one of the things when I was doing my research. So I was speaking with Cotton International, I believe. This is 10 years ago, so my brain is a little bit like, you know, I stopped looking at it so in depth a little bit after that. But looking at what can be done, and there's Habitat for Humanity, which you may know of, who they would take. So they were like a charity, I guess, and they would take things like secondhand clothing, or they'd work with the denim industry and waste from denims, and they'd get rid of all the pieces, and then that was done in Texas, I believe, and then a lot of the shredded fabrics would be kind of baled within themselves, but shredded, and they would be used for building properties. They're like when there's been a hurricane or something in particular nations, so they would do that. And we know that a lot of secondhand clothing is shredded to for the covers and the sheets they use in hospitals. It's used for inside cars and padding and you know, furnishing, things like this. So there is stuff done, but then we're not seeming to combat the increase and growth of the output of the fashion industry and then doing something with it. There's not enough output and results coming from that.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I think it's also, right now, most of the shredded material is used in lower value. It's cascaded down, like you were saying, insulation and stuff. And that, I think the reality is with the situation in Ghana and with the amount of waste that currently exists, and knowing what it's doing to the environment and also what it's doing to the economy. I think there's a need to just shred the material, and if it ends up in mattresses or furniture, like pads and stuff, then that's a start. But our interest is more looking at how this material could be used for like plastics alternatives. So we're experimenting with mycelium, so having mycelium packaging. There's a company here in the United States called Ecovative, and basically you can buy this mycelium and you mix it with hemp hurd with cellulose, and it grows into a shape and can be used instead of plastic, but it's biodegradable. So something that we're experimenting with is basically, can we take cotton, shredded cotton material, and do something similar, because it's also cellulose. And we're hopeful that that will be something that we can try. But some of the people working with us also were like heat pressing the shredded material and created bowls. Like it's actually pretty cool to see what it can become. So I think, there's this need to tackle it on an industrial scale. But again, we're very cautious around replicating patterns of colonialism, right? You don't want to create a solution that is still low value, because that doesn't help anybody. You need to be able to empower people and create something that's value add. So ultimately it needs to be something, that can fuel the fashion industry in Ghana and possibly be an export, but it needs to be something that doesn't just create jobs. Like the secondhand clothing industry creates a lot of jobs, but they're not good jobs. They're not jobs that people
informal jobs, so they're not actually supporting the local economy.
Exactly.
If it's not monitored. And that's the thing, it's like the government, I mean, let's talk about that. The government's, because I asked you earlier, but they do need to get more involved. It is, basically they're receiving waste, they're receiving pollutants, what they're receiving is affecting their own economy, just because, like you said, only about 18% or so is actually worthy to be used at a higher standard, whatever a high standard means, and the rest is just not really that good, and 40% is complete waste. So it's going into their environment. But then it's like there needs to be like more standardizing of the industry when it comes to governments who are shipping that stuff out, because they're basically getting rid of crap, a lot of it. We're just going to be just straight, excuse my French, but they're just getting rid of crap and then dumping it somewhere else, and then it's forgotten. But it's actually affecting the global ecology. And then on the other side, what I was going to say is that we can look at where the East African community, they did ban their secondhand clothing, but then because of Goa and the USA and probably the stress that they were given, I don't know, or I'm just making assumptions, most of them, Kenya, Uganda, what was the other ones?
They didn't go through with it.
Sorry?
They didn't go through with it.
Yeah, only Rwanda.
Rwanda.
President Kagame stood still on, we're not accepting it. Or I don't think they completely stood still. They accepted a small part of it, but they're focusing on their local production, and recognizing to build their economy is going to be taking local manufacturing. If we, we know we're still creating products, but they're want to keep it locally in the country, supporting their own economy. So governments have to. It's down to governments. They're the ones in control. It's not these private companies who are making a huge amount of money. It's a big money business, is secondhand clothing, and either the governments are getting something for it. I guess the taxes for it is huge, so they're getting that from it, or they just don't care. Because come on, it's just my theory, but
no, absolutely. I mean, I do think there's a lack of awareness, but it's also a power dynamic. I mean, in Ghana specifically, importers make a lot of money off of it. So there are some it's a spectrum like any industry, right? There's some people who make a lot of money and some people who are just breaking even,
Yeah.
But within the ecosystem of Contamanto, the importers make so much more money than anyone else, any other role, right? And they're some of the richest people in Ghana. So for them, a ban would be a problem, and that's not something they would support. But again, most people in Ghana wouldn't support a ban, and we don't advocate for a ban because of that. But I will say that importers are speaking up a lot more. So even just since we started our research, when we started research in 2016, it was really hard for us to get any importers to talk to us.
Wow.
They were really afraid, which I think says a lot. They'll never talk on camera still, but they were really afraid to even be seen talking to us because there is a power dynamic. But now, basically the last 2 years, a lot more of them have started opening up to us because they're also struggling because of the amount of waste, and also because the CD has continued to depreciate and the cost of the containers and the cost of the bales are going up. So they're not making as much money as they used to. And again, there is more waste and there's more complaints from retailers than ever before. So importers are actually, I think, starting to consider that it would be better to have less clothing of higher quality, fewer containers every year if they could guarantee that those containers were of better quality. So I think, we're seeing progress already in that conversation, and I think eventually it will work its way towards policy. I really do. I don't think it's that far off.
But I wanted to ask, just as we finish up with this interview, is those people who are shocked by this, things you've been sharing and what's been going on, and want to get involved, maybe in your project or just to know what they could do better, what would you say in regards to what consumers can do better, and those who want to actually get involved in your project to add in advocacy and change making education?
Yeah, great question. So I think just in terms of what you can do as an average person, I think is, really think about your relationship with consumption. I think we started our work really because we started going into classrooms all over the world and realizing that young people as young as 10 knew what it meant to be a consumer. You could ask them, what does it mean to be a consumer? And they could define it for you. And you would ask, what does it mean to be a citizen? And they wouldn't know how to define that, right? We, from the minute that we're born, in the global north especially, we are marketed to, and we are told that we are lacking something and that we have to buy something, to be successful. And I think that it's really important for people to take a step back and really, do a scan of just like their mental model of being a consumer and think about, what really does drive me to buy new things? Is it something that's actually healthy for me? And am I shopping because I'm trying to avoid something that's going on, trying to pay attention to those cues. And I think one way to do that is to not buy anything new for a year. I don't necessarily believe that that's gonna I don't.
You want samples from working in fashion.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know, you not buying anything for a year isn't necessarily going to solve the waste crisis.
But
it'll change the way you think about getting dressed. And that's really where it has to start, I think, is for people to have more agency and to remember that you don't have to buy things, and and when I say don't buy anything new, you could still shop secondhand or take something to a tailor, explore these other ways of engaging with this industry. And definitely, if you do need to donate something, like a very practical advice is to look for organizations that are going to keep the donations in your local community. So, sometimes churches will do drives for people in their community, or again, there are charities everywhere that are focused on a referral model. So they will collect the clothing and then they'll get referrals from people who perhaps have become homeless and give clothing to them.
Mm-hmm.
And you can find those organizations, and that's the best thing to do. And keep, whenever you donate, obviously wash things. Don't donate things that have stains or are torn. Maybe mend it before, but obviously wash it. And, I think another thing is visit your local landfill. That's something that I suggest to people.
Okay, the pictures going up here is going to be enough to show people.
I think experiencing waste in aggregate, because when we live in the global north, we have this luxury of it being out of sight, out of mind, right? Someone comes and picks it up, and we don't ever really experience it. We aren't really forced to reckon with all of the waste that we're creating. And I think, do what you have to do to face that, to confront it, because we are creating an enormous amount of waste, and it just cannot continue. Yes. So those are some very basic things that I think people can start with. In terms of helping us with our organization, we need donations. So we've actually never fundraised before until this year. But we're fundraising because we're running some health initiatives with the Kaya Yei. The Kaya Yei are women who carry the bales on their heads. And we didn't talk about this, but the Kaya Yei typically are migrating from the north. They're very young women, and the bales weigh 120 to 200 pounds. So it's usually their entire body weight or more, and it's very dangerous work. It's not work that they should be doing. And it impacts their skeletal structure. The bales fall and break their limbs. It's really very horrible, and again is just not something that anyone should be doing. And it leads to a lot of other issues, right? Because if they're living in poverty, most people in Kantamanto consider them the slaves of the system. They'll use that language. So when they don't make enough money, they're immediately thrown out. They sleep on the streets. They become victims of sexual violence. It's a very tragic situation. And so it's very complex.
Oh, yeah. It's much more complex than people may even envision. It's just the waste. There's this whole human connection story as well, from connection from those who are giving it away and their mindset, connection to those who are selling, and the informal work or the formal work, and those who are slaves of the system, or that's what they're called. It's much more deeper than just the surface of throwing away the clothes that you're finished with.
Exactly.
And so these stories are ones that need to be told, and I'm glad that are called upon you to do this. So the work that you're fundraising for is to support them, or so they can get out of that work, because they're the ones who transport from where are they transporting from? What's the kind of distance? Or
so they transport it usually from the importers to the retailers. So Kantamanto has two sides, the importer side and the retailer side, and the trips are usually a mile to 2 miles, and they're paid between 30 cents US cents to $1 per trip. So they're not paid very much at all. And the most that they can ever really do is 10 trips a day. And it's rare that they can even do that many. So most of these girls, migrated because they wanted to make money quickly to send home to their family. Some of them consider themselves climate refugees because they're, a lot of the reasons that they're coming down south are because of the drastic changes in the dry and wet season in the north, and it's impacting, their families who are farmers, and there's just not enough money anymore. So they're coming down to try to make money to send home. And it's just not something that should be going on. And so what we're doing is trying to tackle it from multiple angles, because again, there's the sort of, it's push and pull, right? There's what's driving them south. It ultimately has to be tackled. You have to look at climate change issues in the north. You have to start thinking about new methods of agriculture, creating new opportunities for people in the north so that they're not forced to migrate south. but also there's the immediate challenge of just their health. So what we're focused on for the next 9 months are a series of health interventions. So we'll reach at least 1,000 of these girls to register them for healthcare. They'll be getting vaccines and a general health screening, but then also education on sexual health and women's rights. And then also we're doing chiropractic analysis because, you know, we just posted on our Instagram about this. I mean, if you, there's more research in the world right now on, you know, the impacts of staring at our phones and scrolling and texting on our skeletal structure than there is on the impacts of head carrying. And that's something that we think needs to change because, you know, head carrying can be healthy to a certain point of weight, but what they're doing is not healthy. It's very dangerous. So we want to do more research on that.
Yeah, and that's a typical image that people have. I mean, my parents from the Caribbean, mum would talk about that as well. It's something very cultural and just a way of releasing your hands, like putting things up here, or, you know, it makes sense. But then having this extra, that you said, the intense weight that it's greater than we should really be carrying.
Exactly.
Beings, and that's where the long-term effects can happen without people realizing. So that's, yeah, absolutely. I think the research in that would be outstanding for the medical industry. So I definitely want to have the information about the donation to share. I'll write that down here, guys. If you're listening, then do check out the links there to be able to support this project that's raising just topics that's not being discussed enough or not enough research into it. So I salute, you know, you, Liz, and Ransom for what you're doing. If people want to get in touch, then, you know, again, we'll have all the links for them to be able to contact you guys, check out your Instagram, website, and everything else, and come and volunteer if that's something that you offer in Ghana or just in the US, because I know you're between both. Where in the US are you based?
We're in Central New York.
Okay, and then Accra in Ghana is the main area. Okay, any last words that you want to share on this topic? Any last thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say too, I think another thing people can do that's really relevant for what you do is also thinking about sourcing material from the secondhand clothing industry. You know, I think there's a need to also sort of repatriate the clothing and take it back and do something with it. And that's something, you know, we're working with people on, is just upcycling projects and, you know, anything you can do, wherever you are, to start thinking about clothing as material and, you know, alternative uses for it is ultimately going to be really helpful.
That's awesome. I love that new ways of thinking, well, new but old ways of thinking, really. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline.
And it's been amazing. And others who are watching this have learned from it and then can rethink the way we've been thinking about purchasing and consuming and using of clothing, and the finishing of clothing, as well as we end our relationship with them, what we do next with them. So thank you for highlighting these issues.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And thank you all for paying attention.